So Andy Savage, who way back when he was 22 years old, sexually assaulted a 17-year-old who was in his youth group, has now started a new church. He resigned from his megachurch, High Point Church in Memphis last year, and after the scandal broke, and he has now started a new church. And I would like to just share some of my thoughts on that. Now, big warning, this is going to be a major trigger video for anyone who is the victim of sexual assault and especially forced oral sex. I am not going to prettify this. I am going to get down and dirty about what is really involved. I want us to really understand what we're talking about, because sometimes I think we circle around the issues and we don't deal with the ugliness that's really there. And so let's jump in. Now, a ton of people have chimed in on why he is disqualified for ministry, because a minister has to be above reproach. I'm actually not going to deal with those arguments because I think those have been made really well. What I want to talk about more, because I tend to blog more about the sex world, is the actual sex part of what is going on. So the first thing that I want to make very clear is that Andy Savage being restored to a pulpit is not only about Andy Savage and Jules Woodson, the woman who was the victim in this case when she was 17 years old. This is about all the victims who are in the pews and what we are saying to them, because this is a bigger issue than just Andy and Jules. In fact, a lot of the stuff that I will be sharing in this video isn't even specifically about them, but about other cases that are very similar that happened in my hometown and close to me. So this is not something which is a rarity. This is something which is very common and which the church needs to deal with. Okay, so other victims in the pews. Let me just get really graphic for a minute, okay? When a woman is being sexually assaulted, one of the defense mechanisms that she has is that she often dissociates from her body. So she's able to sort of float above what is happening to her, imagine something else going on, think about anything other than what is being done to her. This takes a long time to learn how to reintegrate with your body, and it's part of the healing process later, but it is quite a common defense mechanism. However, in the case of oral sex specifically, it's a very difficult defense mechanism to use, because you can't just ignore what's happening because it's literally right in front of your face, okay? So it's very hard to imagine being somewhere else when it's right there in front of you. Also, when someone is forcing oral sex on you, it can feel like you can't breathe. You can start feeling very panicky. Your heart races. And so these women and girls who go through this stays with them. It is very difficult to get over that kind of trauma. And so I talk to so many women on my blog at To Love, Honor, and Vacuum, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years after the abuse. And they say they still have a really difficult time looking at their husband's erect penis, because it takes them right back to that moment where it was right in front of them and they can't get away from it. This kind of sexual assault haunts women. It really does. I'm not saying other kinds of sexual assault don't also haunt them in different ways. I just want to make it clear that just because it wasn't intercourse does not mean that it is not traumatic. The number of women who come to me and say, I wish I had more freedom in the bedroom, but I don't. I can handle it if he touches me, but that's it. And so you've stolen something from these women and girls. It's gone. And it takes a lot of healing to get through that. And many sexual assault survivors who have gone through tons and tons of therapy still say there are some things that they just can't do in the bedroom that most people can. Imagine these survivors, and there's so many of them. Imagine them sitting in the pews and hearing Andy Savage say that by grace he has been restored. That this happened a long time ago. It was over 20 years ago, and God has forgiven him. And they're thinking, well, you know what? It's been 20 years since my abuse, and I'm still not able to have a great, fulfilling marriage in the way that I want to because something was stolen from me. So here he gets to be restored and the victims don't. And they're sitting there in the pew and they're thinking, why is it that God cares more about the abuser than he does about the abused? Why is it that the abuser can get over this and me, the abused person, is still really struggling and is saying to God, why can't I forget this? Why can't I just have the kind of marriage that I want? Why was something stolen from me and I can't get it back? And so this is not just about Andy. This is about all the invisible survivors that are sitting in the pews and the message that you are giving to them. And that is one of the reasons why pastors who sexually assault congregants cannot be restored. It's not about them anymore. It's about the victims and who you are ministering to and the message that it gives about God to those victims. Because you know what? God cares about those victims. And God does want them to reach healing. And that takes time. And God does not want their noses rubbed in it, that the abusers are able to find that healing when they can't. Okay, second thing I want to deal with, and this specifically has to do with Andy and Jules, but it also is a commonality in some of the other cases that I have seen, is that pastors really honestly feel like it was a consensual relationship. That's how Andy Savage described it. I think he used the words inappropriate relationship, sexual relationship, like it was seen as a relationship. And looking back, he saw it as consensual. These other pastors see it as consensual. You know, they had a crush on a girl, she had a crush on him, it went further than they wanted it to, but that's what happens in relationships when you're that age, right? 22 and 17, that doesn't sound so bad. So that's just what happens, and it was consensual. No, it wasn't. And let me explain why it wasn't. What is it that 16, 17-year-old girls really want? What they're really interested in is figuring out who they are. And the way they do that is in relation to their peer group, right? So they're looking at all their peers. They're trying to figure out, okay, am I important? Am I good? Am I popular? Am I worth something? And the way that you figure out whether or not you're worth something is what your peers think of you. So your peer relationships at that age are the main relationships. I pray and hope that teenagers will base their worth in Jesus, but for many of our kids who are broken, it really is the peer relationship that is so vitally important. And many girls who are going through difficult times and who are searching for their own identity, they may do things with their peers, with their male peers. You know, they may have sex, they may do other sexual acts, whatever it might be. But a lot of that experimentation, a lot of that stuff is done to make them feel like they're worth something. What I often hear in cases of sexual assault is the pastor or the person in power will say, oh, but she was doing this with a whole bunch of other people. Doesn't matter, okay? So those girls, they were doing that to figure out if they're worth something and to figure out how their peers see them. Now, you step into a youth group situation, and here the youth leader is someone, especially if the youth leader is cool, you know, that all of the kids like. Right? Like he's the cool one. And so all of your peers are trying to get this youth leader's attention. They want to be the special one. So if the youth leader singles you out and starts flirting with you and starts paying special attention to you, you start to feel like, okay, I'm worth something. I'm good. And that feels wonderful. Had that youth pastor just been a 22-year-old person in a college and career group, and they started flirting with you, it would not have had the same effect, because the point of the youth pastor is that all the peers were vying for their attention. All of your peers wanted them to like you too. And so when the youth pastor signals you out, it's like, oh wow, like this is important. This feels so good. And now let me tell you what that girl, now I've never talked to Jules Woodson, okay? I have interacted with her on Twitter. I don't think I've ever even direct messaged her. I'm going to use them as an example. I don't actually know what Jules was thinking, but her case is not uncommon. And so what I imagine is that in many of these cases where you have teenage girls with a youth pastor, their goal here is not to have sex with the youth pastor, and it is certainly not to perform oral sex on him. Their goal is to just be in a relationship where they're loved. You know, they're probably dreaming about kissing him, and maybe one day he'll propose and you'll get married, because you have this vision of this relationship that you want where you are loved. And so that is what she is building up in her mind, that she's going to be loved, that she's going to have a relationship, that this is going to go somewhere. And then she's driven off to a dark, secluded place, and he asks her for oral sex. What is she now thinking? Now she realizes, okay, even with him, this person that I was supposed to have this relationship with, he still just wants to use me. Because I'm sorry, but oral sex is not a mutual thing. That is a guy getting a girl to sexually service him. That is not something romantic to girls. That is, I am servicing you so that you can get sexual release while I get absolutely nothing except for a panicky feeling like I can't really breathe. And then, forgive me for being even more graphic, if he finishes that way, she now also has this stuff in her mouth that she has to figure out how to deal with. And that is really, really traumatizing for a teenager that did not want to be in that situation. Basically, what you feel like is, I am now a used Kleenex. And then what happens right after that? Andy gets absolutely overcome with remorse. He leaves the car, he falls on his knees and says, oh God, what have I done? You know, don't ever tell anybody about this. So he feels all of the shame that he then heaps on her. So he just used her to service him. And instead of reaching out and apologizing and saying, I did something terribly wrong, he brings it on himself, like, I need to be protected now. So she is unimportant. She's unimportant sexually because she's going to be used to service him. And she's unimportant in the broader scheme of things because what really matters is that now he has broken his vow to God and he has wrecked his Christian walk. And how has he done that? He's done that with her. And so all of his shame is now placed on her. I see in these cases so many people talking about, oh, but she had these relationships with other guys, or she had already done this before. It's not like she was new to this. This is traumatizing to a girl because of the message that it sends. You are here just to be used by me, and you are someone who has caused me shame, therefore you bear the shame. That is not healthy. That is abusive towards Jules, and that is abusive towards every other girl who has been in this situation. And that is why you can't see it as a consensual relationship. When you combine that with the fact that he was also in a power position, he was her spiritual mentor. He was the one who told her what God thought was okay and what God thought wasn't okay. He had power over her peers, so he could signal whether or not she was a good person to like. So he had tremendous power over her. So just because she went along with the request, just because she actually did perform oral sex without pushing him away does not mean that she wanted it. Plus the fact that with women, often in cases of sexual assault, there's 3 responses. We often hear the fight or flight thing. When something bad happens to you, you're either going to flee and run away or you're going to fight. But there's a third one, and that's freeze. And a lot of women, we're so overwhelmed by what is happening, we can't quite compute it, that we freeze and we just go along with stuff because our minds are freaking out and panicking. And that's extremely common. So just because she didn't fight back, just because it looked like she was consenting, does not mean that she was in the least. He was in power over her. She was in a dark place. There was nobody else around. What exactly was she supposed to do? Even in other cases, if she was the one who initiated the oral sex or other sexual activity, even if he wasn't the one who asked for it, it is still incumbent on him to turn her down because he is the one with power. And so she may be seeking out his approval in the only way that she knows how, and it's up to him to say no. So whatever the dynamics of this particular encounter are, don't really matter. What matters is that it happened. Okay, third point. You are not indispensable in the pulpit. In regards to Andy Savage, I've had so many people tell me, oh, but he had such an amazing ministry. He was so good at what he did. Yeah, you know what? He probably was. And it's tragic that he built up this church and then this church fell apart. You know what would have been better? If he had never built up that church in the first place because somebody else could have done it. This is the thing. Don't we understand that God doesn't need us? There are other people who can step in. And if we are not in the pulpit, there's going to be somebody else who can come and who can feed those sheep. That is not your role anymore. You are not indispensable. What you need to do is just trust that God will use you where he places you. And the place that he's going to place you right now is not in the pulpit. He's going to want you to just do a regular job like everybody else in the church. You can do those things and then God will use you. And to the people in his church who are calling him to be their pastor, you are hurting victims. There are victims all around you. You don't even know who they are. They're invisible because most victims don't even reveal what was done to them. But they are in your pews. They are your neighbors. They are your workmates. And they are seeing how you treat abuse. Because by framing this as a case of God having grace for the pastor, what you're really saying is that he matters more than the victims. And God does not feel that way. You are propping up the wrong person. Let me share with you a Bible passage that I think really applies to this situation. In 1 Samuel 13, there's a story about Samuel and Saul. And Saul is king, and the Philistines have assembled to fight Israel. And Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days for Samuel to come, okay? But Samuel did not come. And Saul's men began to scatter. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. And just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. And then in the rest of the story, we learn that God now rejects Saul as king. Why did God reject Saul? Saul ignored the boundaries that had been set up by God. Saul was the king. He was not the priest. He was not supposed to offer offerings, but he did. Because he thought, well, I mean, here I am. I'm in charge of these troops. These troops need me to do something because they're all getting scared and they're scattering. And so I'm just going to do what makes sense to me. And he did that. And Samuel says, doesn't matter whether it made sense to you or not. You didn't listen to God. You're out of here. And then from that point on, a civil war starts. God has David as a backup. God has already chosen David. And so later on, Samuel's going to anoint David as king, and there's going to be this big civil war. And why was there a civil war? It was because even though God rejected Saul as king, the people did not. Because Saul looked like a really good king. He was winning all of these battles. He was this great military leader. Why would we get rid of him? But you see, he had lost God's favor. And God had a David in the wings to come in there and become king. And instead of going along with that, the people propped up Saul. And that caused so many deaths. And that is what is going on right now, is that people are propping up Andy Savage because they look at Andy and they see all of his gifts and they think he's a great leader. Why can't he be a minister? He gives amazing sermons. And you know what? He very well might. But do you not think that God is big enough to have a David there just waiting to come in? Let me tell you something that I know for a fact was said to Andy Savage to his face. For whatever reason, God is shining light on the churchtoo movement starting with you. He is trusting that you will do the right thing, that you will own up to this. He is trusting that you believe in him enough to own your sin, to do what is right, to step down and to support the victims, and then to go on and live a faithful life without abandoning him. God trusted Andy. And let me tell you, right now, Andy is not living up to that trust. God says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. We need to wait for God to lift us up. And if people are coming around you, lifting you up, even though you know that God has said that you are no longer qualified for ministry, that is not God working. That is people propping up Saul instead of bringing David in to lead. And you need to stop because victims matter. What you are doing is hurting people. What you are doing is setting back the cause of Christ. God can restore you. And God has so much grace for you. But that grace does not involve being in a pulpit. That grace involves trusting him with your life to walk in obedience, which means humbling yourself. It means giving up your dreams of being a pastor. But he will replace those dreams with something else. He will do amazing things with your life when you are willing to live with the restrictions that God places on you because of something that you did. So please own it. Trust Jesus and do the right thing. Stop hurting people. I'm Sheila Gregoire from ToLoveHonorAndVacuum.com, where we talk a lot about sex and marriage and gender dynamics. And I hope and pray that one day the church is going to start to get this stuff right.